The seating chart was printed on heavy cardstock, the kind you only bother with when you're trying to impress people. Derek handed it to me without looking up from his phone. He tapped the back section with one finger, 4 rows behind the immediate family, somewhere between the florist's staging table and the emergency exit, and said, "We had to make some adjustments, sir. Important guests are taking the front. You understand." I looked at the chart. I looked at my name, handwritten in the 3rd row from the back, between a college friend of Derek's I had never met and a blank placeholder marked Vendor, TBD. I didn't say anything. I folded the chart in half, put it in my jacket pocket, and walked to the far end of the ballroom, where a window looked out over the Nashville skyline. 38 floors up. The lights of the city were starting to come on. I stood there for a moment and thought about Sandra, about what she would have said if she had been standing next to me right then. My wife would have said something quietly devastating and then apologized for the interruption. She had that gift. I never did. Sandra passed when our daughter, Claire, was 9 years old. Breast cancer, 2nd time around, and there was no fighting the 2nd time. After she died, it was me and Claire, and the understanding we built together was simple. I would never make her feel like a burden, and she would never make me feel like a stranger. We kept that deal for 22 years, until Derek. If you've ever given everything to someone and then watched them hand the bill to someone else, you already know how this story ends. Stay with me. Because the part that nobody at that rehearsal dinner expected, including my daughter, is still coming. I'm 58 years old. I spent 30 years as a commercial loan officer at a regional bank in Nashville. I reviewed thousands of credit applications, restructured hundreds of accounts, and spent the better part of my career helping small business owners figure out whether their numbers told the true story or the story they hoped was true. I retired early, 14 months ago, when the bank was acquired and my position was reclassified. They called it a voluntary separation package. I called it my cue to leave quietly, which I did. My name is Raymond. I've been a widower for 22 years. I own a modest house in East Nashville, drive a 6-year-old pickup, and spend my free time fixing the neighbor's fence and watching baseball on a television that is probably too small for the living room, but feels right for one person. I am not a man who takes up a lot of space. I never needed to. Claire met Derek Weston about 3 years ago at a corporate fundraiser downtown. He was 29, already running his own commercial landscaping company. Weston Property Solutions, he called it, and he had the kind of confidence that reads as ambition until you know him well enough to see it's something else. Claire fell for it fast. She's always been drawn to people who move quickly and speak with certainty. I suppose I raised her to admire conviction. I just never imagined that quality would someday be pointed directly at me. The first time Derek and I had a real conversation, he asked me to dinner. Not a family dinner, a working dinner. He had his numbers on a legal pad and a question about commercial credit. His company was growing faster than his cash flow could support, and he wanted to apply for a revolving line of credit through a regional lender. He sat across from me at a steakhouse on Broadway and spread his projection sheets on the table and asked me to tell him what the bank would see when they looked at his file. I spent an hour with him that night. I walked him through the coverage ratios, the debt service calculation, the way underwriters read the first 2 pages of a business statement before they read anything else. I told him which numbers to lead with and which to bury in the appendix. I told him that the story a loan application tells in the first paragraph is almost always the story the approval committee believes. He took notes. He thanked me. He shook my hand at the end of the night and said, "Raymond, I'm glad Claire has you." That was 2 years ago. I thought about that dinner a lot in the 48 hours after he handed me the seating chart. The rehearsal itself was held on a Thursday evening at the Alderton Grand Hotel, a venue Derek had chosen because it had been featured in a regional lifestyle magazine, and his mother had mentioned it to Claire 4 times in a single month. The ballroom could seat 280 people. The Weston family had reserved it for 215. My side of the guest list accounted for 19 people. Claire's aunt and uncle who drove up from Chattanooga, a few of her friends from college who were more loyal to me than to her, because I had let them stay at my house the summer after graduation, and a handful of people I had worked with over the years who loved Claire like a niece. 19 people in a room of 215 seated in the rows closest to the emergency exit.
I watched Claire during the rehearsal run. She was beautiful. She wore a pale blue dress and had her hair pulled back the way she used to when she was concentrating on something hard in school. She laughed at the right moments and touched Derek's arm the way people touch things they are still discovering. She did not look at me. Not once during the 90-minute rehearsal did she turn toward the back of the room.
I told myself it was nerves. I told myself she was focused. I told myself the story I needed to believe to get through the next 4 days without becoming the problem. After the rehearsal, there was a cocktail hour in the adjacent lounge while the room was being reset for the dinner. Derek's parents, Gerald and Marilyn Weston, held court near the bar. Gerald Weston had built a commercial real estate portfolio in the 90s and retired wealthy. Marilyn had the particular posture of a woman who had spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this one and considered them her natural habitat. Gerald introduced me to 2 of his business partners as Claire's father. He worked in banking. The pause before banking was small but precise. It had a specific weight to it, the weight of a word being used to mean something other than its definition. I smiled. I said it was nice to meet them. I took a glass of sparkling water from the tray because I had stopped drinking at 60 and didn't miss it, and I found a quiet spot near the window and watched the room. Then my phone buzzed. It was an email from a former colleague at the bank. His name is Marcus, and he had moved into the compliance division after the acquisition. The subject line said, Account Review, Weston Property Solutions, Documentation Request. I stepped out into the hallway and read the full message. Marcus was not reaching out to give me information. He was reaching out because he was confused. During a routine audit of commercial accounts inherited from the acquisition, his team had flagged a restructured revolving credit line held by Weston Property Solutions. The original application and the restructuring memo referenced a loan officer review, my review, conducted 18 months before my retirement. The restructuring had extended the credit line, changed the collateral terms, and included a compliance note I had written that was still embedded in the active account file. The compliance note, which I had written at the time to protect the bank and frankly to protect the borrower from overextending, included a conditional clause. The clause stated that the credit line terms were contingent on annual confirmation of the collateral valuation and that the confirmation had to be submitted by the original reviewing officer or a designated successor. Because of the acquisition and the reorganization of accounts, no successor had ever been designated. Marcus was reaching out because the annual confirmation window was open. And because my name was still technically on the file as the reviewing officer, the system had generated an outreach flag to me. He wasn't asking me to do anything improper. He was asking whether I had any documentation or institutional knowledge that could help the compliance team close the flag cleanly. The alternative, he wrote, was that the credit line would be flagged for a formal review, which could temporarily suspend draw privileges while the account was being audited. I read the email twice. Then I went back inside, got a fresh glass of sparkling water, and found my seat in the fourth row from the back. I did not call Marcus that night. I did not call him the next morning either. I took a walk around my neighborhood, ate breakfast alone, watched the first 2 innings of a game that didn't matter, and thought carefully about what a man owes the people who have disrespected him and what he owes the truth. There is a version of this story where I call Marcus immediately, give him everything he needs, and say nothing to anyone. I thought about that version. I thought about it seriously.
Because that is what I had always done. Absorb the cost, protect the people around me, and stay quiet. Because the alternative was making things worse for Claire.
But Claire had watched her fiancé point me toward the back row and said nothing. She had not come to find me during the cocktail hour. She had not texted me that night. And when I checked my phone at 10:30 and saw no message from her, I understood something I had been explaining to myself away for the better part of a year. I called Marcus the following afternoon, Friday, and told him I had limited access to the original documentation, but could direct him to the institutional file through proper channels. I also told him, truthfully, that the compliance note included conditions I could help clarify, and that I would be happy to join a brief call with his team and the account representative the following evening if that worked. Marcus said, Saturday evening was unusual but workable. He said the account representative had actually flagged urgency on his end as well, since the annual draw he'd been planning for a spring equipment purchase was pending the confirmation. I told Marcus I understood and that I'd make myself available. What Marcus didn't tell me, but what I found out when I asked a quiet question through an old colleague, was that Derek Weston had already submitted a draw request against the credit line for $420,000. The draw was to fund the purchase of 3 commercial-grade mowing rigs and a new fleet vehicle. The timing was tied to a contract he'd signed with a property management group that expected equipment delivery before the end of the month. The draw was sitting in queue. It would not release while the compliance flag was open. I thought about Sandra again that night. I thought about what she would say. She would say, Raymond, you are not responsible for what other people do with the grace you extend to them. She said things like that. She meant them. I extended grace, but I also showed up on Saturday. The rehearsal dinner was held at the hotel's private dining room on the 38th floor. 60 guests, the inner circle, the people the Westons considered meaningful enough for the intimate version of the celebration. I had been included on this list, I think, because excluding the bride's only living parent from the rehearsal dinner would have been a visible social error even by their standards. I was seated at the far end of the long table, between Claire's college roommate and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be Derek's aunt. The table was magnificent. White linen, low floral arrangements. Crystal that caught the candlelight in ways that probably photographed beautifully. Gerald Weston sat at the head. Marilyn sat at his right. Derek sat beside Claire near the center, where a couple is supposed to sit when they are the reason everyone is there. I had a glass of water. I watched. I waited. Dinner was served in 3 courses, and between the second and the third, Gerald Weston made a toast. He spoke about Derek's drive, his vision, the company he'd built from nothing. Gerald's word, nothing, which was delivered with particular warmth, and the future he was building for his son and his new bride. He said, Weston Property Solutions was positioned for its strongest year yet, and that the equipment acquisition coming in the spring would push them into a new tier of the market. He said Derek had the instincts of a natural businessman. Derek accepted this with the particular modesty of a man who has been told he is exceptional for so long that modesty has become another performance. Then Gerald raised his glass toward me, and of course to Claire's father, Raymond, who we're glad to have with us this evening. The pause before Raymond was longer than the one before banking had been. I nodded and raised my water. That was when my phone vibrated. I excused myself quietly, walked to the hallway outside the private dining room and answered. It was Marcus. He apologized for calling on a Saturday evening. He said his team had been trying to reach the account representative. Derek's company had listed a contact for the credit line, but had not been able to get a confirmation on the compliance flag closure. He asked if I had the documentation ready to submit. I told him I did. Then I told him something else. I told him that the account representative was, coincidentally, present at an event I was also attending that evening, and that if Marcus needed to speak with him directly, I could facilitate that conversation. Marcus said that would actually expedite things considerably. He said the flag needed to close by end of business Monday, or the draw request would be formally suspended pending a 90-day review. I went back inside. Derek was talking. He was telling a story about the spring contract, about the property management group, about what the equipment acquisition would mean for the company's capacity. Gerald was nodding. Marilyn was smiling. Claire was looking at Derek, the way she looked at things she wanted to protect. I sat down. I waited until Derek finished his story, and the table began the gentle sounds of transition, forks lifted, glasses refilled, conversations breaking into smaller threads. Then I said, in the even tone of a man who spent 30 years sitting across tables from people who needed things, Derek, I have someone from the bank compliance division on a call in the hallway. They have a flag on your credit line. The annual confirmation window closes Monday. It would be worth a few minutes of your time tonight if you want the draw to go through on schedule. The table went quiet the way tables go quiet when a word lands harder than expected. Derek looked at me. The particular arrangement of his features in that moment. Confusion first, then recognition, then something he was working very hard to keep off his face. Told me he understood exactly what I was saying. He said, that can wait until Monday. I said. The compliance officer said Monday end of business is the cutoff. The $420,000 draw is sitting in queue. I don't know what your contract terms are with the property management group, but if the equipment delivery is time sensitive, you may want to take this call now. Gerald Weston set down his fork. He looked at his son. Marilyn looked at the centerpiece. Derek pushed back his chair and came around the table. He did not look at me as he passed. I followed him into the hallway, introduced him to Marcus by speakerphone, and then stepped 6 feet away and looked out the window at Nashville while the two of them talked. The call lasted 11 minutes. I don't know everything that was said. I know that Marcus explained the flag, explained the timeline, what was needed. I know that Derek's voice went from managed to strained somewhere around minute 4. When Derek ended the call, he stood in the hallway with his phone in his hand and his jaw set in a particular way. He said, "You could have called me directly." I said, "I could have." He said, "Why didn't you?" I looked at him. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. I looked at him the way I used to look at credit applications that told a story they couldn't quite sustain. I said, I wanted to make sure the right people were in the room. Then I went back inside, finished my water, stayed through dessert, thanked Marilyn for a lovely evening, kissed my daughter on the cheek, and drove home. Claire called me the next morning, Sunday, at 8:47. I was sitting on the back porch with coffee, listening to the birds arguing in the oak tree. She said, "Dad." I said, "Good morning, sweetheart." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Derek told me what happened last night, in the hallway." I said, "I helped with a compliance issue." She said, "Dad." I said, "The draw should go through by Tuesday if the paperwork is clean. His spring contract should be fine." Another silence, longer this time. She said, "He put you in the back row." I said, "He did." She said, "I saw it and I didn't say anything." I said, "I know." She started to cry. Not the performance tears of an argument. The real ones, the ones that don't have words attached, that just come because something true has finally been said out loud. I listened to them. I didn't rush her. After a moment, I said, "Claire, I will be at your wedding on Saturday. I will be proud to be there. I will sit wherever they put me. But I need you to understand something. The man you are marrying looked at me. The man who raised you alone, who worked 30 years so you never went without, who was sitting 2 feet away from you at that rehearsal and introduced to his father's business partners as someone who worked in banking. And he put me in the back row. And you saw it. You need to decide what that means to you. Not for my sake, for yours." She cried harder. I let her. The wedding happened on Saturday. It was beautiful. Genuinely beautiful. The kind of afternoon that makes you believe in the possibility of good things for young people. Derek's company credit draw went through on Tuesday as expected, which I know because Marcus sent me a brief courtesy message. The spring equipment arrived the following week, and the property management contract was fulfilled on time. I walked Claire down the aisle. Gerald Weston had quietly revised the seating arrangement by Friday afternoon, and I found myself placed in the second row, beside Claire's aunt and uncle from Chattanooga, with a clear sightline to my daughter's face. Whether that change came from Derek, or from Gerald, or from Claire herself, I never asked. At the reception, Derek shook my hand. He held it a beat longer than was necessary, which is its own kind of acknowledgement. He didn't say anything that addressed what had happened. Men like Derek rarely do, but there was a difference in how he looked at me. Not respect, exactly, but the revised estimate a person makes when they realize they've been operating on incomplete information. Gerald Weston found me near the bar where I was drinking water and watching my daughter dance. He said, "You were in banking a long time." I said, 30 years. He said, "Derek will be better for knowing you." He said it carefully, the way a man says a thing when he means something adjacent to it. I said, "I hope so." Then I watched my daughter dance, and I thought about Sandra, and I thought about the 30 years between the small house we bought together and the elegant ballroom her daughter was celebrating in tonight, and I let myself feel both the grief of everything that was gone and the quiet satisfaction of still being standing. I stayed for 2 hours. I danced once with Claire's aunt, who laughed the whole time and told me Sandra would have loved the flowers. Then I found Claire at the edge of the dance floor, and I hugged her, and she held on longer than a quick hug, and I held on with her. I drove home alone on Saturday night. The city was quiet on the interstate. I got home a little after 10, made a glass of iced tea, and sat on the back porch in the dark. The oak tree was still. The birds were done for the day. The air had that particular weight of a Tennessee spring night, warm and heavy, and honest the way things are when nobody is performing for anyone. I thought about what it had cost me, not the seating chart, not the cocktail hour or the banking pause. The real cost, which was understanding, clearly and without the comfortable haze of excuse-making, that my daughter had watched her future husband treat me as a man who could be moved without consequence. And she had stayed quiet because that was easier. That was the cost. That was what I had to carry home. I love Claire. I will always love Claire. But something changed that week. Not broke, changed, and I think she felt it too. In the months that followed the wedding, she called more often, and when she called, she asked different questions. Not the questions of someone checking in with an obligation, but the questions of someone who has seen a thing clearly and is trying to understand what they saw. That is something. Maybe it is enough. I don't spend a lot of time on the word revenge. It doesn't sit right with me. What I did in that hotel hallway was not revenge. It was accuracy. I told the truth in the right room at the right moment. And the truth had consequences that were already built into the situation before I arrived. I didn't create the compliance flag. I didn't create the deadline. I didn't put Derek's company in the position of needing that credit line to function. All of that existed before I walked into the Alderton Grand Hotel with a folded seating chart in my jacket pocket. What I did was refuse to disappear. That is all. After 30 years of making other people's numbers add up, after 22 years of raising a daughter by myself, after a week of being pointed toward the back row of my own child's wedding, I simply refused to disappear. Sandra would have approved. I think she would have laughed a little too.
If you've ever been treated like the background in your own family's story, like someone they can count on to absorb the cost and ask nothing in return, you know exactly what I mean when I say that some things aren't about revenge. They're about staying visible. They're about not letting the people you love most convince you that your seat doesn't matter.
Your seat matters. If that landed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me whether you think I should have said something in that ballroom when Derek handed me the seating chart, or whether waiting was the right call. I read every comment. And if you want more stories about men who refuse to disappear quietly, subscribe to Charles Revenge. New stories every week, real costs, real consequences, and the kind of quiet justice that doesn't make headlines but changes everything.